I went out to dinner yesterday with Eileen and a family named Joshua from yesterday. And we were greeting each other because he was making a joke about how he had met somebody who was Arabic. And they were greeting each other, Yalla Habibi, which means, you know, I love you, my brother, I love you, my brother. To which I replied, Shalom, Shalom. So we were going back and forth with that all day yesterday. So if you were here yesterday, raise your hand. Okay, so some of you have heard this before, but I really appreciate you guys coming out again. My name is Aybars Uckun. I work for a nonprofit called the Al-Maida Initiative. We facilitate friendship and worldview conversations between Christians and Muslims. Our tagline, as you can see on the graphic, is conversations without compromise. We do this in a bunch of ways. Primarily, we do dinners over Ramadan, where we train churches to be able to facilitate Ramadan dinners in a church. So we will have Christians and Muslims come together over a meal. We don't have a presentation where, you know, all right, here's a 5-minute thing or a 10-minute thing on Islam, and then here's a 10-minute thing on Christianity. We are focused on having conversations. We're focused on people being friends and developing relationships with one another. Because if you don't talk to each other, that's how you get the situation we have now, where people are mistrustful of one another. We believe in going through the front door. We believe in talking to Muslims, letting them know exactly what we believe, and that we can't change their minds. That's ultimately up to God. Our Ramadan dinners, you know, last Ramadan we had over 500 people at 10 dinners with a 50-50 Muslim to Christian split, which is pretty much unheard of. But, you know, we're experiencing great things. We even had one in New York City. We look at expanding them all over the country. And next year we hope to have one in Dubai. So, you know, God is doing great things in the Islamic world. I'm the development director there. I've been there for about 4 years. Prior to that, I was the Messianic rabbi, assistant Messianic rabbi at a congregation in North Seattle called Restoration with Rabbi Matt Rosenberg. He's a great teacher, by the way. If you are looking for good Messianic teaching, I'm going to give him a plug. You can just look up Matt Rosenberg Seattle on YouTube, and his stuff will come up. So I have 6 children. It's like the most fantastic thing I'm going to tell you today. The most miraculous and unbelievable thing is that I have 6 children and we had twins twice. I found out yesterday that I have a laser pointer now. And it's not working on the screen. There. How does that work? Oh my gosh. I point it there, and then what happens? That's insane. Oh, I got a different one now. Okay. But it's still doing the same thing. Listen, nobody can fight Samsung. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. So I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way like I did it yesterday. My wife is in the middle there. Her name is Kelly. We've been married for almost 20 years. The fellow in the white shirt next to her is my oldest. He was here yesterday with us, but I let him sleep in today. His name is Max. The guy in the black shirt on the side, his name is Jack, and his sister, Emmy, is on the other side of the guy in the white shirt. They are twins. And the girl in the pink sweatshirt is Abigail. And the 2 in the front are also twins. So I had twins twice. Yeah, and the one in the crutches is Ruby, and the other one is Nora. And Ruby broke her ankle on the first day of summer vacation, so poor kid. And I joke with everybody saying, look, I have 6 kids under 17 years old, and I'm only 28 years old. That's, you know, don't let the gray hair fool you. No, that's not true. I am 52 years old, and I love what I do. I love that I work with the Al-Maida Initiative. So I went through a little bit of a journey to get here, though. And I want to share with you today my testimony, how I left Islam, and became a believer in Yeshua, and a little bit about God's plan for the Islamic world and ways we can serve him to reach Muslims with the love of God. So I was born in 1974 in Turkey. My father is an Afghan refugee, and my mother was, living in Turkey when they met. My father's story starts when in Afghanistan, and he was a political activist. So what he did was try and inspire his people to kind of push for rights for Uzbeks. My dad is an Uzbek, so for those of you who have like a 9/11 context, in 9/11, the Uzbeks were part of the Northern Alliance. They were the ones primarily resisting the Taliban prior to 9/11. But before that, they're an ethnic group within Afghanistan. There are 5 ethnic groups within Afghanistan, and the Uzbeks are one of the larger ones. And my dad was trying to push for more rights for his people. He wanted his people to have equal rights. He wanted his people to have voting rights. And he was also a very good public speaker. He would draw crowds to himself. And eventually what happened was that got him a target drawn on his head by the king of Afghanistan. King of Afghanistan put a bounty on his head, and my dad had to leave suddenly in the middle of the night with a couple of his friends who were also in similar trouble. And they walked from where they were in northern Afghanistan over the mountains into Pakistan, going from village to village, really relying on the kindness of shepherds to feed them. My mother told me that they wrapped their feet in plastic bags and then leaves at one point when their shoes wore out. And they made it to Islamabad. And they applied for refugee status, and they were denied. And then what they tried again, they bribed somebody to smuggle them into Iran. So this is prior to 1979, prior to the revolution in Iran. And they tried the same thing. They tried to apply for asylum, and it didn't work. So they figured maybe the third time is a charm. And then they bribed somebody to hide them under a bunch of suitcases and blankets in a bus, and they smuggled them into Turkey. And that's where my dad's fortunes began to change. My dad is an Uzbek, like I said earlier. Uzbeks are considered part of the larger Turkish world, right? They're part of the, like the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. They speak a Turkic language, and they have Turkic lineage. So they actually accepted his application. He started to get settled. My mom also told me that at one point they were living in a shed that they had built, squatting on somebody else's property. It's a little different in the Islamic world, especially at that time period, because if you were homeless and somebody built a shed on the corner of your property, they would kind of look the other way, as long as you weren't being, awful about it. And then he met my mom. They were both teachers. My dad spoke 5 languages. He was brilliant. He taught math and chemistry and physics. And then he met my mom, who was also a teacher, and she helped him with his Turkish and their asylum laws. And they wound up getting married, and they had 4 boys, of which I am the youngest. So that takes you to 1974, and in the 70s, the Soviet Union was starting to stir up some trouble. They were trying to destabilize the Turkish government. They were giving the young people Marxist ideology and guns and drugs, and they were trying to get them to push back against, a hard, like kind of bedrock secular Turkish culture that had existed at the time. And it's unfortunate, not too much social commentary here, but you can kind of see some of these same things happening here, right? Like there's a lot of unrest, and they were trying to do the same thing there. So my father, with 4 children now and married, decided that he didn't want any part of that, and that he wanted to raise his kids somewhere that was safe. So he looked at France and Germany, but then he decided that he had an opportunity to go to America, and everybody knows that in America the streets are paved with gold, right? He was going to come here. Actually, I left this out yesterday. One of the people he left Afghanistan with had made his way to Brooklyn. So that gentleman sponsored us, and we all got on a plane when I was 40 days old, and we flew across the Atlantic and wound up in Brooklyn. And my dad started looking for a job. He had worked previously for Mobil Oil, and then he found the same job, and we settled in New Jersey. So that's where I grew up. I'm a Jersey boy. I lived there for 38 years. And then, growing up in New Jersey as a Muslim, things were like a little different for me, right? I grew up around all Catholics. I grew up around Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics and Hispanic Catholics and Haitian Catholics. My best friends were all Catholics. And, growing up in that environment, things could get a little weird for you as a Muslim kid, right? Like, everyone else would go home for dinner and they'd sit at the dining room table and they'd set the table, and we would come home and we would sit on the floor. We had like a carpet that we put on the floor, and we'd put the big meal in the middle and all the sides, and then we would all eat off of that, and we would watch television, and my dad would make me change the channel, right? Because that's how it worked back then. We didn't have remote controls. Oh, and then we got cable, and it got worse for me because I was running back and forth between the cable box and the switcher and that really ancient tech that we have now. No streaming services, right? No Disney Plus. And, everyone else, like around Christmas time, would go to services, right? They'd go to their Catholic Mass. And we would sit around at home. It was like the most depressing time of the year for me. When you're in an environment like that, and you grow up like that, you can slowly start to feel isolated. And when you feel isolated, you develop a sense of alienation, right? Like, I feel alienated from people, particularly at different times of the year, because I am not a part of their lives. The ironic thing is that I wound up going to a Catholic school, and that made it actually 10 times worse, because, from first grade to fifth grade, my parents had a delicatessen in Princeton, New Jersey, right next to St. Paul's Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church. And, it was literally like a half a block away, so it was really easy to get back and forth from school to the store. And my day was like, I would go in there, and, everyone would participate in Catholic life and Catholic practice and Catholic education, but I was a Muslim. So it was super weird for me. And then you'd have Mass every, twice a week they'd have Mass for the students. So we would all go into the church, and everyone would, genuflect and bow and, get up and take communion like we're going to do today. But I couldn't because I wasn't Catholic. So again, develop a sense of alienation. Like, I don't fit in and I don't belong. So I would go home and, tell my dad what I learned during the day, and he would essentially deprogram me. I mean, I don't hold that against him. He was being a good Muslim. He was trying to be a good dad. He was trying to teach his kid the way that, we lived as a family in this world that was not Muslim. So I would tell him that I learned about, this guy at the top of the church who was on this cross that kind of freaked me out, right? Because it was like 30-foot tall statue of Jesus on a cross suffering. And I would tell him what I learned. And I'd tell him, I learned about, Noah's Ark today. I learned about, Jesus walking on the water. And he would say, well, we don't believe that. And he would explain to me why we were Muslims. So that's the way I grew up. But as I slowly started to become a teenager, at that age you start to question, right? You just naturally enter into a sense of questioning, like, what do I believe? What do I really believe for myself? And the more and more I paid attention, the more and more I noticed that there was kind of like hypocritical behavior around the Muslims in my life. Like, there was a lot of outward piety, but then there was a lot of like backbiting. There was a lot of gossip. There was a lot of when somebody would turn their back, they would like say nasty things about them. So, I had noticed this, and this sense of uneasiness was growing over time. And honestly, I felt alienated from them too, because, a lot of the people who my dad had attracted would follow him all over the place, and they were immigrants from Afghanistan, and they spoke Farsi, and I did not. They did not grow up here, and their children didn't grow up here. So, we would be friends and we would play basketball and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, I was Turkish and they were Afghan. So one day, I remember in particular, I had a flashpoint moment where my mom, my dad hosted a bunch of people and they all came to the house and they would stay for days on end, and my mother would cook and clean for them. She would make sure that they had food. I mean, she had a full-time job. And then, she would come home and she would take care of these people, make sure that there was food, fresh bread, tea, And they had gotten done praying in the living room. And, they were doing their Islamic prayer where, you bow and you get up and you look so pious and, outwardly kind of like in deep communication with God. And then they were done and they lit up their cigarettes and my mom brought them, tea and food and everything. She was taking care of them. And when she left the room, they started saying, bad things about her in Farsi. Like, my Farsi's not great. Like, it's close enough to Turkish where I can understand words. But, they were making fun of her because she didn't speak Farsi. She only spoke Turkish. And they were kind of essentially saying, look at this Turkish woman who doesn't know how to speak Farsi. And listen, I'm Turkish, I'm an ex-Muslim, but at the end of the day, I'm from Jersey. You don't talk about my mama. You do not talk about my mama. So I looked at that and I said, if that's Islam, I don't want it. I don't want that. I don't want to have this kind of outward thing where I'm praying and I'm fasting, I'm doing all these like things that are supposed to make you righteous and holy, but then get up and turn around and blast the woman who's taking care of you. Why would I want that? So I decided that I was going to become an American. I'm going to become an American teenager. That was about the time that I discovered the NFL. So I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and you can boo me now. But we did beat y'all in the Super Bowl that one time. And, listen, it was a close game. Could have gone either way. And you guys have way more Super Bowls than us, so I'm not going to hold that against you. Maybe 2004. But I started playing football, and I wrestled, and I, made all my friends were athletes. And that was my entire life. I know you can't tell now, but at one point, I was a pretty dedicated athlete. Life catches up to all of us, doesn't it? And I would go to practice, and I would go to work. And I would go to practice, and I would go to work. And I would go to wrestling meets, and I would go to football practice. And then finally, in my senior year, like your senior year is going to be your year, right? My plan was to get good enough at the game of football that I was going to try and walk on at a college in Western Pennsylvania, right? Like a Division II college. I wanted to play football. And I showed up for the first day of camp, and my dad, they told me that I was a half a credit short. So I was academically ineligible. And I said, well, fix it. And they said, well, we can't. I'm like, why can't you fix it? They said, well, we can't. It's too late in the year. And my parents, were like immigrants, and they didn't really get it. And it was, like beyond their ability to fix anyway. So what's the worst thing that can happen to you when you're a teenager? You lose your people. I lost my people. I lost my structure. I lost, everything that I had, and that kind of pushed me into a depressive state, right? And then on top of that, I'm not saying like poor me, but you already grow up feeling alienated, right? And then this is supposed to be your moment, and it's just kind of like taken from you. And then, so there were the smart kids, and there was the jocks, and then there was everybody else in beautiful, lovely downtown Trenton, New Jersey. And I can assure you that everybody else are like the hard scrabble, leftovers, right? I'm not smart enough to be with the smart people, and I'm not able to access the athletic part of my life anymore. So I started going to parties, and I started hanging out, and that's when I started experimenting with drugs. And listen, the stoners and the burnouts, I still have a huge heart for them, but they will let anyone hang out as long as you bring an eighth of weed, right? If you bring the marijuana, you bring something to party with, it doesn't matter what. If your name is Aybars Uckun, they do not care, right? Like, you can come hang out. There's no social order to it, you know? As long as you bring like a bottle or something to share, right? And that's what I did. And I did that for 7 years. By the end of those 7 years, I had really experimented with pretty much every drug. I did pretty much everything except for heroin, and I know myself, that was definitely on my radar, and I wanted to try it. But, you know, as you all know, that if you live that kind of life, you experience its consequences. And I experienced its consequences. I'm not a particularly good liar. I'm not good at hiding things. I was really good at getting caught. So at one point I got caught by the police. I used to host these parties, and I told Eileen this the other night. I used to host these parties, and you know, kind of like super brave, like, no, you know, no one's going to bust us, no one's going to bust us in my apartment complex. And then the cops came, and they knocked on the door of my apartment, and I was waiting for somebody to come over. And I had laid all the drugs out on the table. And I didn't even look through the people. I just thought, like, hey, Doug. And there are the cops looking at all of my stuff on my table. So that put me in a situation where I was, you know, in possession of a controlled dangerous substance with the intent to distribute. So they looked at it like that was going to be actual time for me. And then they locked me up, and they took me to jail, and I was super high when they did that. And they took me and they handcuffed me to a bench next to a transvestite prostitute wearing a blonde wig, who would look at me, and he was like licking his lips and making eyes at me. And you know, when they say they handcuffed you to a bench, it's not like on Law and Order where they're like, they sit there and they sitting there and your arms are handcuffed behind you and they're like, tell us where the drugs are. No, I'm kidding. They handcuff you to the bench. They handcuffed me to the bench like this. So I just remember I was so high and I was like passing out that I would look up at this guy, and he would like look at me and like start making overtures towards me and like licking his lips. And I tell people that's when I started calling upon the name of the Lord. I was like, God, get me out of here. Thankfully, you know, they put me in a different cell than that guy, and I wound up walking out. I had my hearing the next morning, and I remember standing on the steps of, you know, that police station and saying, God, I can't stop. Like, I can't stop myself. I knew that I didn't have the self-control to stop for myself. And, you know, in the middle of having like a scared straight moment, where I just started to say, like, I can't keep living like this. But that led me also through like a spiritual crisis. I realized that I did not have the answers. I have a tattoo on my arm of a yin-yang in the shape of a sun. And that's kind of what I believed, right? That there was like good, and there was bad, and there's a little good. There's a little good and bad, and a little bad and good, and that it all has to come from somewhere, so that's why it's in the shape of a sun, like some form of energy. But I realized, like, I didn't believe that. Because what was I crying out to when I was in that jail cell? Who was I talking to? Like, when I was in trouble, I didn't call upon the I Ching to come and deliver me. I called upon God. I said, God, get me out of here. And it was a real moment for me. It was a real moment for me. So I started, you know, researching, like, what do I really believe? I started diving into world religions. For about 8 months, I studied pretty much everything I could get my hands on world religions. I started looking at the I Ching. I started, you know, kind of deconstructing what I believed. At the time, you know, I would say that what I believed was something called, I'd like to call transcendental pharmaceuticalism, right? This is kind of like a hippie, you know, good, evil, good, bad, or whatever, pass the joint, right? But I realized a couple of things. That I didn't believe in ancestor worship. I didn't believe in karma. I didn't believe in the Buddha. I definitely believed that there was a God. There was a being. And that kind of was leading me back towards Islam because that was my context. That's what I believed. So I went and I talked to my dad, who was wise. He had memorized large portions of the Quran. He could recite them. But he was very kind, and he listened to everything I said. And I said, Dad, listen, I'm having legal problems. But more than that, I have questions about God. Can you help me answer my questions about God? And he said, I'm not a scholar, but I know people who can train you to be an imam. So in Islam, you're not qualified as a regular Muslim to just pick up and start studying the Quran. You can read it, but once you start trying to get into the deeper moments, you have to defer to this group of people called the scholars. They are the gatekeepers of information in Islam. They're the ones who are supposed to tell you what the text means. Your context of that would be mine, kind of like a priest in Catholicism, right? Like the priest, it's their job to study. It's my job to be a good Catholic, right? They're supposed to tell me what that is. Well, in Islam, it's the imam's job to study, and it's my job to be a good Muslim. So my dad, even though he knew a lot, did not feel comfortable in telling me. But when he told me that I could study to be an imam, I got excited because I was like, this makes perfect sense. Islam and studying to be an imam will give me structure. It'll answer all my questions. And, I'll have a path forward. I'll finally have structure again. So that's what I was going to do. One of these days, I'm going to write a book. And the book is going to be titled, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Mosque. And, my backup plan was that I was going to write music with, I'm a musician. I play 3 instruments, and I've been in bands all my life. You guys have a great worship team here, by the way. These 2 guys are they're good. I know good. And, his girlfriend at the time had reconnected with her best friend from high school who wound up being a Christian. And, they would try to introduce us hey, you're single, she's single, maybe you two should talk. And, I had questions for her, and I'd ask her what she believed. And she would explain what she believed. And the more and more that, they kind of orchestrated us to be together, the more questions I had for her. And eventually I said, would you like to go out on a date with me? Because she was cute. And she said, well, I don't date not Christians, but you can go to church with me. I said, you know what, fine. This is good because I'm charming and I can woo her over. And I had real questions, right? I had real questions about how, what do you believe? And I expected them to take me to a place where, there was a guy, kind of like in the Catholic school that I had been in, that he would have a black suit on with a collar. And later on in the week, they showed up on a Friday night. She showed up with friends. I'd never been on a supervised date before, but here we are. And we got in the car, and we drove to a Messianic synagogue in Philadelphia called Beth Yeshua. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but they are an intense dancing congregation. I mean, they have circles, right? Circles within circles. And people are dancing full speed one way, and then they're dancing full speed another way, and then on the outside, and there are all these guys, and they're in suits, and they have their talits and their shofars, and it's I'm like, what the heck is going on here? But for me, I'm having a cultural experience, right? That's what I'm telling myself in my head. This is a cultural experience. This is a cultural experience. And, as a musician, I'm kind of into the fact that the music is in a minor key, and I'm just taking it all in. And then it all ends, right? And the rabbi starts preaching, and I completely tune out, right? I'm all right, he's talking, and I'm just going to look at the floor. This is 1997. I didn't have a cell phone. I always joke with people that I think if I had a cell phone, I probably wouldn't be saved because I wasn't paying any attention to what he said. But in the middle of the message, he says this one line. Saddam wants to destroy Tel Aviv, but Yeshua won't let him do that. So I'm sure you all know, Yeshua is the Hebrew name for Jesus. And I remember thinking, well, I know who Saddam is, but who's Yeshua? And at that moment, the lights were off in the room, but it was like they came on around me. I was surrounded by a very bright and powerful light. And kind of like if you're in the ocean and a wave just kind of like hits your whole body, and you can get totally immersed by the wave, but still be kind of like conscious of who you are and what's going on around you. It was like that, but in a room. It was in a room just like this. Sitting here looking at a carpet just like this. And my only thought prior to that was, are we going to go out to the diner? And like literally minutes later, I am immersed by this very strong and powerful presence that's come around me. It's all over me. And it was so powerful that I didn't feel like I should pick up my head because I thought I would see feet. And all I heard was, I'm Yeshua. And I didn't know what to say, but I felt like there was an invitation to follow. I had been looking for God for months, and this was clearly God. Clearly. So I just said, I'm coming. I didn't know what else to say. There was no altar call. I didn't raise my hand at the end of a sermon. Nobody acknowledged it. Nobody knew. But I just said I was coming. And then slowly it went away, and I spent the rest of the time standing there like, what just happened? Like, what's going on here? And then after the service, their young people kind of surrounded us, and they told us about a synagogue that was closer to my house. That was Beth Zion in Jackson, New Jersey, and the rabbi there was Jan Rosenberg. And that was also where I met Brian. So I went there 2 weeks later, and I have a funny story. I won't tell it now, but if you want to know me and Brian's story, I'll tell it to you after. And I went there 2 weeks later with that girl. She stayed for 6 months, and I stayed for 15 years. I wound up becoming the youth leader, and then I was the college and career leader, and I was like a deacon, and at one point I was on an elder track, and we were talking about maybe me taking over. This was particularly after Brian had left. So I married my wife. I met her. She was living in Philly at the time. And then we had our first kid. And then we went from 1 kid to 3 kids. So we were like, these kids need some family around them. And she wanted to move back to Seattle, where she was born. And I was like, I don't want to move there. I want to stay in New Jersey. But God has a way of changing your heart. And he slowly started, chipping away at me and kind of put me in a position where, all right, I'm ready to go wherever you tell me to go. So she got a job offer to move to Seattle. And then we started going to the Messianic congregation that I was telling you about earlier, where Matt Rosenberg is the rabbi. And he eventually hired me to be his worship leader and then later his assistant rabbi. So I was there for 10 years. And I loved my job. I loved it. I was discipling people. I love organizing systems. I replanted that children's ministry like 4 times, right? Came up with ways, I was trying to make things better, right? We were trying to build a next generation Messianic synagogue. And everything was great until 2021. And then in 2021, there was this thing that happened, which was the fall of Kabul. And that was when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, before I got saved, the Taliban had gone through our village, and they had systematically killed everyone in my dad's village. They killed 5,000 people in one day. They raped the women, they raped the children in front of the men. They killed the women, they killed the children. They took the men, they tortured some of them. they'd peel their skin off and leave them to die in the streets in front of it. And then they would killed most of the men, but the ones who they kept alive, they would, remind me to come back to that one. They would leave them to die in the streets. And then the ones that they kept alive, they would cut off a hand and a foot, opposing hand and opposing foot, because that's a punishment in Islam for a kafir, a traitor. And their only crime was they disagreed with the Taliban. They were also Muslims, but they disagreed with the way that they resisted the Taliban. And then they would take their eyes out but leave their tongues so that they could say who had done it. And I was watching people throwing their babies over fences. And I was watching them fall off of airplanes because they were hanging off of airplanes. They wanted desperately to flee what they knew was coming, and I knew what was coming. And it was one night where I was watching television, and it wasn't like a who will go for us moment. It was a I'll go. I can't just sit here and watch this happen again. So I went in sabbatical in January of 2021, and while I was on sabbatical, I just felt like the Lord was hammering me on, this idea that there's so much low-hanging fruit in the Muslim world. There's so much low-hanging fruit in the Muslim world. And I went to Turkey to visit my mom, and while I was there, I just came to the conclusion that if I didn't do this, I was going to wind up being disobedient to the Lord. So I came back, and I got asked to do a podcast with the Al-Maida Initiative on the fall of Afghanistan. And after that podcast, they offered me a job. And I said, okay, let me pray about it, which is the safest answer usually. But I prayed about it for a couple of months, and I just felt like the Lord was telling me to do it. So I came back from sabbatical, and I handed my resignation, and I joined the Al-Maida Initiative. And that's what I do now. I go into places like this. I develop relationships with churches, and we train people to reach out to their Muslim neighbors. And I think, it's important for us because, my story is my story, right? But how does that impact you? Really, how does this matter to all of you? My story is my story, and I'm part of an organization, and you can choose to be interested in that or not. But why does it actually matter? The truth is that there are millions of Muslims who are in the same situation that I was in. They're also trapped in isolation. They're also dealing with depression. They're trapped in a religious system that leads them away from Yeshua instead of towards it. Muslims, just like you and I, like when we have hard life circumstances, we cry out to God for deliverance. They're just like anyone else. But instead, without accepting Yeshua as their Messiah, they'll remain separated from God. See, the difference is that we have access and they don't. It's very simple. It's just like anyone else. But the good news is that Yeshua is able to draw Muslims to himself. He did it for me. He can do it for them. Even though they might seem to be like the wildest of olive branches. And this is what I mean by that, right? Like if you turn on the news right now, Iran is bombing its allies. To this day, Iran is doing like the stupidest tactical thing you could possibly do in bombing Saudi Arabia, the one country that kept you from being bombed, right? The Emirates, bombing the Emirates, the countries that were stopping you from being bombed. You're bombing your allies. What's more wild than that? But God is able to take them and graft them into the abundant life in Yeshua. And if you don't believe that, I have 15 Iranian Christians I want you to talk to. Iranian Christians who came to the Lord in the middle of protests. Iranian Christians who were like, I want to study the Quran. I want to be an imam, just like me. But God took them, revealed himself to them, and is able to graft them into the abundant life of Jesus. So just like in the Exodus, right? This is the picture I'm trying to paint for you here. Just like God delivered the Jews from Egypt, God is able to deliver Muslims from Islam and set them free to worship the one true God. Yeshua the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And we can see this in Revelation 7:9-10. After these things I looked, and behold, a vast multitude that no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, was standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Every nation, Muslim nations, non-Muslim nations. But today we're going to focus on the Muslim nations, the ones that seem like are not reachable. It seems like these places are closed. God has a prophetic plan to bring Muslims to the world, living in the Islamic world. He wants to bring them salvation. And we can see this in Isaiah 19. And what I'm about to tell you in Isaiah 19, there are so many places in prophecy where you look at and you say, like, okay, that was fulfilled at this date and at that time. This has not yet been fulfilled. The burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rides upon a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. Egypt's idols tremble before him, and Egypt's heart melts within them. I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian. Everyone will fight against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of Egypt will drain within it, and I will confuse its counsel, so that they will resort to idols, charmers, mediums, and familiar spirits. I will give the Egyptians into the hand of a cruel master. A fierce king will rule over them. It is a declaration of the Lord of hosts. I went back and I checked the Hebrew on this today. This is a clear implication of Pharaoh. This is just like what happened to the Jews. This kind of cruel master and fierce king is one who is an oppressor and a bringer of death, right? So, we could look at it and say, well, maybe it's a system, right? Maybe it's a system. Maybe it's the Islamic system. But maybe that's true, but it's more likely that this is a Pharaoh-like individual. And during these confusing times, a cruel Pharaoh-like oppressor will rule. He will bring fear, oppression, and scarcity to all Egypt. His rule will bring about political and economic turmoil to his own people and bring tension with Israel. And you're seeing the fruits of tension with Israel right now, right? War. In that day, Egypt will be like women trembling with fear, because the shaking hand of Adonai Sevaot, which he is about to wave over it. The land of Judah will terrify Egypt. Anyone who mentions it will be afraid because of what Adonai Sevaot has surely proposed against it. In that day, 5 cities in Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord Almighty, and one of them will be called the City of the Sun. The City of the Sun is Hierapolis, also known now today as Alexandria. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt and a monument to the Lord at its border. Think about that for a second, right? In downtown Alexandria and on the border of the country, there'll be monuments to the Lord. The monuments to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It will be a sign and witness to the Lord Almighty in the land of Egypt. They will cry out to the Lord because of their oppressor. He will send them a savior and a defender, and he will rescue them. And this is interesting language, because you could think that this is an Egyptian general or this is some coalition force. But when you get into the Hebrew, the idea of a savior and a defender is not just someone who liberates from oppression, but one who is also able to forgive sin. One who is also able to forgive sin and rescue from death. And the Lord will make himself known to Egyptians. And in that day, they will acknowledge the Lord. So in this state of desperation, a revival will break out in Alexandria. It will spread throughout Egypt. And it will result in all of Egypt turning to the Lord. Not just 5 cities, the entire country. God will bring healing to Egypt, and they will respond. And in that day, it says, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians will come to Egypt, and the Egyptians to Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. And in that day, Israel will be a third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth. For the Lord Almighty has blessed, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. So this is a map of the Assyrian Empire in the time of Isaiah. And if you look at that little island off to the left of the map, just above it is where I was born, right? That's a place called Mersin, the city of Mersin. It's one of the oldest port cities in the world. It's where Cleopatra met Mark Antony, right? Right in that corner of the world. And that empire has swollen and expanded and contracted over time until it was eventually wiped out. But if you go to my mom's town, you can see Sumerian and then Assyrian and then Hittite and all of these different civilizations living right on top of each other. And you can go and just view what's going on in those places. And it's evident that, there was this Assyrian presence there. All of these nations enter into a covenant with God. And they're all called by names that reference the Abrahamic covenant. There's only one way a nation can receive this kind of blessing. They must call upon the name of Yeshua. There's only one way to be grafted in to the tree of salvation. There's only one way. You must call upon the name of Yeshua. You must accept him as your Lord. You must accept the atoning gift and the sacrifice of Yeshua to be able to be brought into the kingdom of God. So these nations have experienced a revival. There is a shared context now. So all of these countries now, they're all Islamic countries. Today the nations are known of Israel and Egypt are known, but what about Assyria, right? You look at the map. There's Iraq. There's Syria, there's Turkey and Iran. There's also Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel. These are all Islamic countries except for Israel. There are like 350 Muslims living in this area right now, right? So 150 in everywhere but Egypt, and then the rest are in Egypt. This is a huge population, but one day they will experience revival, and they will call upon the name of the Lord. This shows us that God has a plan for the Middle East, and for Muslims everywhere to come to know Yeshua. So again, what are we called to do? What can we do to bring about this prophetic plan? You see, God's promises were made in the past, and they'll be fulfilled in the future, right? So the foundations of what was promised was all the way back in the garden, when Eve was promised that her offspring would trample the head of the serpent. And then later on with Abraham, right? Ancient promises that were given to Abraham that are now fulfilled, right, in Yeshua the Messiah. But today, we, here in this room, are called to work towards those promises. There's a thing that God is calling each one of us to be able to fulfill the promises of God in our generation. So how do you do that? I would say, particularly as it pertains to Muslims, train your mind to see Muslims as opportunities and not opponents. So this is really interesting because if you were to go on Google right now, there's probably about 15 or 20 guys with millions of followers who are debate experts. They get up and they debate Muslims. There's so many social media platforms and people will, be live on TikTok and another platform called Twitch. And, people will call in or not call in, nobody does that anymore, but they'll join your conversation and it'll turn into a big debate. It'll be like the Muslim debater versus the Christian debater. And I think that's viewing them as an opponent because you're trying to win the debate. But I think that we have an opportunity here as followers of the Messiah, as followers of Yeshua, as disciples of Christ, where we can do something different. We can look at what's happening around us, and instead of looking at them as like an imposing, invading force, that we can say, look, God's given me an opportunity to do something different here. Maybe I can make a friendship. Maybe I can step out of my comfort zone, and maybe I can befriend a Muslim. Maybe I can have an actual conversation with them where I want to know what they believe, and then maybe keep up some kind of relationship with them that'll open up a doorway for me to be able to talk about what I believe. Muslims are really curious people. They really are. They might not seem like it when you start talking to them because it's kind of weird. When you start talking to Muslims, you're like, their customs are different, and the women wear hijabs, and it's just also like, it can seem like very cold and closed off. But I guarantee you, once you start talking to them, you learn a lot of different things about them. You learn about their culture. Again, I was talking with Joshua last night, and, he was in Israel, and he was talking to Arabs, and the second that he said those two words, Yalla Habibi, which means I love you, Habibi, essentially, right? They melted. They melted, and they wanted to spend time with him. When you show interest in anyone's culture, think about like a husband and a wife, right? Like when you were dating your spouse, if you're married, what drew you to them? Well, first of all, whatever their outside package was, but it was what was going on inside. And the second that they showed an interest in what you were doing, you knew it was mutual, because that's the basis of relationship. So what I'm saying is that take that same approach. Don't be afraid to take that same approach, to learn to talk to somebody, to be interested in what they're going through, to learn about what they believe. Listen, you know what you believe. You go to church every week. You know what you believe, right? You're a part of a fellowship. You're growing as a disciple. You want to serve the Lord. You know what they believe, but you don't know what they believe. And if you treat them like an opponent, you miss the opportunity. Amen? Understanding Muslims and how to communicate with them is just like learning a language. It takes time. It takes learning to kind of understand how they communicate. Like, they don't necessarily have the same understanding of religion that you have. So, for instance, if you talk to a Muslim and you say, hey, I believe in Jesus, what you'll hear often is, well, I believe in Jesus too. And you're like, what are you talking about? You believe in Jesus? And they'll say, well, we believe he was a prophet. We believe that he was born of a virgin birth and that he worked miracles. But we don't believe that he was resurrected. You'll even hear things like, we love Jesus more than you do because we revere him more than you do. I'm like, no, you don't. But the point is that once you learn what they believe, you start to slowly understand, like, all right, that's where you're coming from. And it's a lot like learning to put syllables together in language. It's a lot like learning, like, all right, you can even do it with math, right? Like, to me, 2 + 2 = 4. But for some reason, their context, 4 + 2 = 11. And it doesn't make sense unless you spent time trying to figure out why they think that way. Does that make sense? Right? Like, you can look at what they believe. They've been through systematic, essentially, deprogramming from Christianity and a reprogramming of the Islamic viewpoint on things. So for us to be able to learn what they believe, you have to kind of systematically say, like, I'm going to educate myself a little bit on what they believe, and I'm going to compare it to the Bible, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to try and communicate the Bible to them within their context. So remember, Muslims are not harder to talk to than anyone else. Listen, I'm from Seattle. People are hard to talk to. There's a real thing called the Seattle freeze. People, are not like very open to strangers. I remember I came back here. I went to New York City last November. And, New Yorkers are like just really open and honest and direct, right? And, you smile at people on the street and they smile back at you, right? You probably experienced that here. This is a nice, friendly town that I've been in for these last couple of days. But then I went back to my own church and I started smiling at people and they all looked away. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess I'm home. Right? Because Seattleites don't like direct eye contact for some reason. So it can be hard to talk to them, but it's not harder to talk to a Muslim than them. And then the more and more that we try and connect on things like, hey, I have a family, right? Well, they all grew up and they're family-oriented. So you can find a place of commonality there. I like coffee. Listen, I was explaining to somebody last night. They're like, what kind of coffee do you like? I'm like, I like all the coffee. I'll drink the Turkish coffee, the Brazilian coffee, the Yemeni coffee, the Starbucks, the Dunkin'. I'll drink it all, right? because that's my context for coffee. They like coffee too. And if you want to meet with them over coffee, they probably will because they like coffee. They're not harder to talk to than anyone else. And listen, we want to help. So the Almeida Initiative, for free, we produce content on our YouTube channel. And I highly recommend it. Here's a QR code, and we'll leave it up at the end. And then you can sign up for our newsletter. I'll have my iPad out later, and I can help you sign up for our newsletter. We give the stuff away for free. We are supported by offerings. We're a 501c3. It's tax deductible. If you feel led to give, please give, but there's no pressure to give. And when you go to the YouTube channel, you'll see a lot of different videos that we've produced that answer questions that Muslims ask about Christianity. So our goal with the YouTube channel is to make Christianity more understandable to Muslims and make Islam more understandable to Christians. And it all comes from a Christian worldview. We're believers. We love the Lord. We're not syncretic. And we believe that God can equip you through these materials to be able to make an impact with the Muslims in your world. It was brought to my attention yesterday that there is a mosque like right near here. So I know that like when I go to the Walmart in my town, that there are, at any given time, like 20 Muslims in there. It'll be a mom with like 4 kids and a bunch of teenagers trying to get a soda or something like that, and a bunch of guys running in to go, get something from the auto department, right? And they're Muslim guys. It's clear that they're Muslim. They're speaking Arabic, right? Clear as day. And now you have a mosque here. So who do you think God wants to reach them? Like, is it another church? Is it another fellowship here? Or is it you? Is God inviting you to be able to take part in this thing that, to borrow some phraseology that we applied to the Jews, for them it will essentially be the same because they are part of the family of Abraham, life from the dead. Their culture didn't die, but they're spiritually dead. They're spiritually dead, and they need to know Yeshua. They need to know Jesus is their Messiah, and we believe that you can be the vessel to do that. So if you're interested, you can download the QR code. We are also available at almeida.org/mail. That's how you get to our mailing sign-up sheet. But we realize that almeida.org is kind of a mouthful and a handful to type out. So you can also look us up at muslimsandjesus.com. So thank you for your time, and I really appreciate you all. I'm grateful to be back here for the second day, and I just love Brian. Can I just back up to that? I know I'm going all the way to the back, and I skipped it. But they went through so much trouble to put it in the PowerPoint today that I didn't want to make sure I missed it. I've known Brian for so long. I'll tell you the story real quick. When I first got saved and I went to that Messianic synagogue, 2 weeks later, the first person I talked to when I went back to go get a cup of coffee at the end, was Brian. And he said, so, what'd you think of the service? And listen, I was like brand new in the Lord, like brand new. I had not talked to really any Christians in those 2 weeks. So I looked at him, I said, it was effing great. and I tell you that story because he reminds me of it all the time. But that's Brian and Suze. Our bass player, Bruce, was in the back. We were in a band called Olive Branch. And that's me playing the congas. They're coming home from that very conference right now. I didn't realize it, but that girl, the blonde girl, like kind of in front of Brian, next to the brunette, that was my ex-fiance. I showed my son. He was like, Dad, I'm so glad you married Mom. I was like, me too, buddy. Me too. But listen, the relationship that I have with Brian is, what brought me here. I didn't just come here to talk. I really wanted to pour into his people because he loves you and I love you too.